Thank you all for being here this evening. And on behalf of Cambridge University Bahá'í Society, I welcome you to the final of a series of 8 talks. I see we have some regulars as well as some new names. So I'm going to do an introduction. My name is Catherine. I'm a member of the Cambridge Baha'i community. In collaboration with the Cambridge University Bahá'í Society, these 8 talks have been organized to commemorate the centenary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, which was on the 27th of November, 1921. Abdu'l-Bahá was the son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith. After the passing of his father, Abdu'l-Bahá became the head of this new religion and the perfect example of the faith's teachings, which are unity was the fundamental principle. For this, he was also a prisoner for over 40 years, but he was also knighted by the British for his humanitarian work. He traveled, and as we have heard in previous talks, he traveled to the West, meeting individuals from different social backgrounds, professions, and faiths. But I feel that this is simplifying his significance and his place in history. The aim of these 8 talks have been to delve a little deeper and understand a little more who Abdu'l-Bahá was, his impact at the time, and how relevant Abdu'l-Bahá is to us today, not only in the Baha'i faith, but for everyone. Your microphones and cameras have been turned off, and this is being recorded. Please use the chat feature to ask any questions, which will be addressed at the end of the talk. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening. Robert Weinberg is a broadcast journalist and producer for radio programs for both the BBC and independent radio in the United Kingdom. Robert has held positions as senior producer and on-air editor for Classic FM, during which time he made programs with Sir Edward Heath, Paul McCartney, the Three Tenors, and countless other leading figures from the arts world. Robert is a regular writer on art and a reviewer of exhibitions for the Telegraph paper called Apollo Magazine, the Art Story website, and the British Art Journal. Since 2020, Robert has been producing and presenting broadcasts and documentary films for historian Dan Snow's History Network. So tonight's talk is entitled Abdu'l-Bahá and the Modernists. The presentation brings to light the little-known personal meetings that a number of these influential figures had with Abdu'l-Bahá from 1892 to 1921, and their responses to his personality and message. So I now hand over to Robert. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Just going to share my screen, so I hope you can see the slide. So Catherine's done a nice introduction there about Abdu'l-Bahá, but maybe at the end, if people have further questions, you can put them in the chat. And if anyone has some specific questions about Abdu'l-Bahá, I'm very happy to attempt to answer them. But the main theme of this talk is, as Catherine just said, the relationship that Abdu'l-Bahá had with some of the leading figures in modernism in the 20th century. So I was recently reading about the early days of modern art in Britain, and I came across a number of references to this gentleman, Professor Michael Sadler. He was a historian, an educationalist, a university administrator, and he was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Leeds. And while in Leeds, Professor Sadler was president of an avant-garde cultural group called the Leeds Art Club. The Leeds Art Club was founded in 1903 by these 2 gentlemen, Alfred Orridge and Holbrook Jackson. And the Leeds Art Club met weekly to discuss socialist and anarchist politics, mixed in with the philosophy of Nietzsche, suffragette feminism, theosophy, modern art, and poetry. The club had close associations with the Independent Labour Party, the cooperative movement, and the early Fabian Society. And some of the speakers who visited the Leeds Art Club included writers like George Bernard Shaw, W.B. Yeats, So the Leeds Art Club was an important meeting ground for radical artists and thinkers, educationalists and writers. But most significantly for the history of art in Britain, history of modern art in Britain, Michael Sadler built up a remarkable collection of abstract paintings and expressionist paintings at a time when such works were either unknown or dismissed in London, even by well-known promoters of modernism. One notable painting that Michael Sadler owned was this Kandinsky painting, Fragment for Composition 7, painted in 1912. Michael Sadler also owned Paul Gauguin's celebrated The Vision After the Sermon. And according to one source, Sadler even invited Kandinsky to visit Leeds before the First World War broke out. Michael Sadler's name immediately rang a bell with me, and I recalled that when Abdu'l-Bahá gave his farewell talk to some 460 people during his first visit to London, this farewell talk was held on the 29th of September 1911 at the Passmore Edwards settlement in Tavistock Place. I remembered that the chairman of that gathering was none other than Professor Michael Sadler, and there he is sitting at the table with Abdu'l-Bahá to the left. Introducing Abdu'l-Bahá, Michael Sadler said this: "We have met together to bid farewell to Abdu'l-Bahá and to thank God for his example and teaching, and for the power of his prayers to bring light into confused thought, hope into the place of dread, faith where doubt was, and into troubled hearts the love which overmasters self-seeking and fear. Though we all among ourselves in our devotional allegiance have our own individual loyalties, to all of us Abdu'l-Bahá brings and has brought a message of unity, of sympathy and of peace. He bids us all be real and true in what we profess to believe, and to treasure above everything the spirit behind the form. With him we bow before the hidden name, before that which is of every life the inner life. He bids us worship in fearless loyalty to our own faith, but with ever stronger yearning for union, brotherhood and love, so turning ourselves in spirit and with our whole heart, that we may enter more into the mind of God, which is above class, above race, and beyond time." So my first question was, how did Professor Michael Sadler come to be chairing a meeting with Abdu'l-Bahá in London? Now, at the same time, I found out that the radical modernist Percy Wyndham Lewis had also attended the Leeds Art Club, and he introduced an exhibition there of Cubist and Futurist art in 1914. Wyndham Lewis was the founder of the short-lived Vorticist movement in Britain, which had its roots in Cubism and in Futurism. Though the style grew out of Cubism, it's more closely related to Futurism. Futurism was an Italian art movement in the early 20th century, which celebrated the dynamism of the machine age and all things mechanical and modern. The name Vorticism was given to the movement by the poet Ezra Pound. Now, Wyndham Lewis was also the founder of a short-lived literary magazine called Blast, and this acted as a kind of manifesto for the Vorticist movement. Only 2 editions of Blast magazine were published, the first on the 2nd of July 1914, and it featured this bright pink cover, which was referred to by Ezra Pound as the Great Magenta-Covered Opusculus. Blast is a manifesto, a long list of things which were, in the Vorticist view, either blessed or blasted. Whether something or someone was blessed or blasted depended on how they were seen by the Vorticists. Now, very curiously, among the blasted, we find the name Abdu'l-Bahá. You can see it highlighted here, a few rows down. So here we have the most radical of British modernist manifestos that has somehow decided that Abdu'l-Bahá is among those to be blasted, along with, perhaps you'll notice, Sir Edward Elgar, the Post Office, and cod liver oil. So my second question was, how did Abdu'l-Bahá come to be blasted by Wyndham Lewis and the Vorticists? What did they have against him? The main link, I believe, between Michael Sadler, Wyndham Lewis, and Abdu'l-Bahá appears to be the poet Ezra Pound. And the early engagement of these key modernists, as well as early Baha'is and supporters of the Baha'i movement, with Theosophy, and more particularly, a number of publications that emerged from factions in the Theosophical Society. Now, the Theosophical Society was formed in New York City in 1875 by a Russian noblewoman called Helena Blavatsky, an American colonel, Henry Steele Olcott, and an attorney called William Quan Judge. And the object of the Theosophical Society was the scientific investigation of psychic or so-called spiritualistic phenomena, after which its three chief objects were declared, namely the brotherhood of man, without distinction of race, color, religion, or social position, the serious study of the ancient world religions for purposes of comparison and the selection therefrom of universal ethics, and the study and development of the latent divine powers in man. In 1881, Madame Blavatsky wrote, "The Theosophical Society teaches no new religion, aims to destroy no old one, promulgates no creed of its own, follows no religious leader, and distinctly and emphatically is not a sect, nor ever was one. It admits worthy people of any religion to membership on the condition of mutual tolerance and mutual help to discover truth. The founders have never consented to be taken as religious leaders. They repudiate any such idea, and they have not taken and will not take disciples." Theosophy was a very dominant force on artists and writers in the late 19th and early 20th century. When we look at Kandinsky's work that was owned by Michael Sadler on the right, these controlled explosions of color bear a striking resemblance to images that appear in Thought Forms of 1901, which was a standard theosophical text, which is basically about synesthesia. That's the condition where people hear sounds and see colors when they hear a sound, or vice versa, they see a color and they hear a word in their head or so forth. Kandinsky himself had this condition of synesthesia. So what we think of as being very radical modernist painting in terms of, say, Kandinsky, there seems to be a very direct link here with the thinking of theosophical ideas. Another theosophist was Mondrian, who was a very well-known pioneering modern painter. And Mondrian wrote that, "I got everything from Madame Blavatsky's secret doctrine." And here you can see one of Mondrian's early paintings, and similarly, an illustration from a theosophical text about the astral body. In 1909, G.R.S. Mead, who was an English writer and the secretary to Madame Blavatsky, left the Theosophical Society, protesting at scandals concerning one of its prominent members, Charles Leadbetter. Leadbetter had become involved with Theosophy after reading the works of and meeting A.P. Sinnett, who was a journalist and a close friend of Lady Blomfield, who was one of the leading Baha'is in London in the early years of the 20th century. When Abdu'l-Bahá came to London, he was her guest and stayed in her apartment in Cadogan Gardens for the duration of his stay. So on leaving the Theosophical Society, G.R.S. Mead, along with some 150 members of that society, formed the Quest Society, and they subsequently recruited around 100 more attendees to their meetings. They held lectures at Kensington Town Hall, a regular attendee of which was Ezra Pound, and among those who lectured to the Quest Society was Wyndham Lewis. Mead published a magazine called The Quest, which welcomed contributions which exemplify the investigation and comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science as complementary to one another in aiding the search for that reality which alone can give complete satisfaction. One of the writers for the quest was Wellesley Tudor Pole, a name also familiar in the history of the Baha'i faith in Britain. Others included W.B. Yeats, the Nobel Peace Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore, and Ezra Pound himself. In Pound's famous verse collection, Cantos, he appeals to an esoteric tradition, which is very much like the ones found in the writings of G.R.S. Mead. When A.R. Orridge and Holbrook Jackson left the Leeds Art Society, they took over the running of another magazine called The New Age. It began life in 1894 as a publication of the Christian Socialist movement, but in May 1907, it was transformed into a radical weekly. Orridge and Jackson took over the journal with financial help from George Bernard Shaw. The New Age helped to shape modernism in literature and the arts for the next 15 years. Ezra Pound was also a regular contributor to the New Age. Now, on the 21st of September 1911, in an edition of the New Age, some 2 weeks after Abdu'l-Bahā's arrival in London, we find the following, written by Orridge. Seeds of strange religions are wafted from time to time to our shores. But fortunately or unfortunately, they do not find the soil in us in which to flourish. The latest to land in public is Baha'ism, of which indeed many of us have heard in private these many years. We are told a Baha'i must take part in some work for the benefit of the community. From this, we forecast less success in England for Baha'ism than for Christian Science, let us say, that makes no such demands on the idle rich. It's quite a cynical view, but interesting that he writes that many of us have heard in private of Baha'ism for many years. So I think that's one of the phenomenon that we forget now, that the Baha'i faith was very well known amongst certain classes of people in the early years of the 20th century. And so Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to London after being a prisoner in the Ottoman Empire for more than 50 years was something that was greatly looked forward to and greatly covered by the press, and many people, prominent and otherwise, flocked to meet Abdu'l-Bahā. So it would seem that the close relationship between Alfred Orridge and Professor Michael Sadler from the Leeds Art Club was one sure connection that links Sadler to Abdu'l-Bahā. Also, Sadler's leading position as a forward-thinking educationalist would seem to chime with the progressive educational values of the Passmore Edwards settlement, where Abdu'l-Bahā gave his farewell talk. Another great supporter of the Baha'i faith, Alice Buckton, was intimately involved with the work of the settlement, and she invited Abdu'l-Bahā to visit her and Annette Sheppel at their home in Byfleet in Surrey, where a number of working women from the Passmore Edwards settlement were spending a holiday. A further journal which gave prominent coverage to Abdu'l-Bahā's message was the Fortnightly Review, to which Ezra Pound, as well as other famous figures such as Roger Fry, Hilaire Belloc and Thomas Hardy, who's been an architecture apprentice to Lady Blomfield's husband, were contributing in the same period. In June 1911, an article, Abbas Effendi, that's Abdu'l-Bahā's original name, Abbas Effendi, His Personality, Work and Followers, was published in Fortnightly Review, written by E.S. Stevens, based on her personal experiences during a visit to Palestine at the turn of the century. A second article appeared in April 1912, Constance Elizabeth Maud's Impressions of Abdu'l-Bahā. Both of these writers were also close friends of Lady Blomfield's. The day after Orridge's article appeared in the New Age, Ezra Pound wrote to his future wife, Dorothy Shakespeare. They tell me I'm likely to meet the Baha'i next week in order to find out whether I know more about heaven than he does. Whatever the decision, I bet I can give him points on hellsware. Pound later wrote to a music student, Margaret Cravens, who was a friend of his who lived in Paris. I met the Baha'i yesterday. He's a dear old man. I wonder, would you like to meet him? He goes to Paris next week. I'll arrange for you anyhow, and you can go or not as you like. It's interesting that we have a very sort of cynical American writer, modernist writer, whose tone has changed pre-meeting Abdu'l-Bahá to at least considering him to be a dear old man afterwards. On the 6th of October 1911, Pound writes to Margaret Craven again, the Baha'i, Abdu'l-Bahá Abbas Effendi, or whatever you like to call him, is at the Dreyfus Barneys, and anyone interested in the movement can write and see him there by appointment. It's more important than Cézanne, and not in the least like what you'd expect of an Oriental religious now. At least I went to conduct an inquisition and came away feeling that questions would have been an impertinence. The whole point is that they have done instead of talking, and a Persian movement for religious unity that claims feminine soul equal to the male and puts Christ over Buddha, to the horror of the Theosophists, is worthwhile, even if a lot of silly people get mixed up in it. So he didn't quite understand what Abdu'l-Bahā's teachings were, but again, it's interesting that he was moved and impressed by the character of Abdu'l-Bahá. He came away feeling that questions would have been an impertinence. Another key person that connects Ezra Pound with Abdu'l-Bahá was Laura Barney, but more particularly her sister Natalie, who held a famous salon in Paris, which attracted most of the great literary figures, including Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Marcel Proust, Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, Ernest Hemingway, many others. Rainer Maria Rilke certainly also knew about the history of the Baha'i Faith and its roots in the Bahá'í movement. In April 1899, Rilke paid a visit to Tolstoy with the Russian psychoanalyst Lou Andreas Salome and her husband, the Orientalist Friedrich Karl Andreas, who had published a paper about the Bahá'í movement. Salome later reported that Tolstoy paid little attention to her and Rilke. Rather, she says, his interest was more focused on deep and invigorating discussions about the Bahá'í movement with her husband. So the Barneys and Pound had several acquaintances in common, including George Bernard Shaw, who was the patron of the New Age magazine. Natalie Barney met Abdu'l-Bahá in London at Lady Blomfield's on the 19th of September 1911, and on the 20th of October in Paris, she took Rémy de Gourmont to meet the master. Rémy de Gourmont was a hugely influential French critic, novelist, and a leading critical apologist for the symbolists. These were painters and poets who predate modernism, but were drawing on mythology and symbolism in their work, a bit like the pre-Raphaelites, you might say, to kind of evoke a golden age, a sort of heroic golden age of chivalry and mysticism. And there were different kinds of symbolists in different parts of Europe. And in Scotland, for example, there was a lot of harking back to ancient myths and folklore from Scotland. Anyway, Rémy de Gourmont was one of the sort of leading proponents of symbolism. And he wrote this in La France. A handsome old Persian man is currently amongst us. Persia is a home to religions. Many religions of the past came from there, including the founders or reformers, Zoroaster, Mani, and Ali the Bab, who were so persecuted. Baha'ism extends Babism, but with even fewer rites, forms, or external aspects. It comes in the guise of a very sweet and simple philosophy that wants to unite men in peace and love, a philosophy at once naive and sweet, against which one may look for objections in vain. This religion was taught to me yesterday by the master, in a language rich with Oriental flourish, that Monsieur Dreyfus translated into French with an ease that amazed me almost as much as Baha'ism itself. The eloquent patriarch spoke to us of the simple joys experienced in the Baha'i city, of pleasures designed to delight the docile hearts, where spring is eternal, ever flowering with the perpetual blooming of lilies, violets, and roses, where women smile and men are happy in the perfume air of love. And we spoke of the great truth that excels all the previous truths, in which our little human errors are melted and transformed, as such quarrels disappear in the shade of the greatest peace. And we felt a deep passion in the faintly halting voice, roughly punctuated by the guttural sounds of the Persian language, but also gently punctuated by the phrasing of his musical laughter. For the prophet is joyful, and we all feel within him the gaiety of being a prophet, upon whom 40 years of prison have left no trace. He had with him a bouquet of violets, offering one to each of his visitors, to the most resistant to his teachings and to those who had the audacity to stubbornly oppose him. The Palmer violets serve as his arguments, as do his hearty laugh, his beautiful and poetic arguments, and the simplicity of his Persian dress. Another hugely influential figure in modernism in France, who was connected to Abdu'l-Bahá through the Barneys and through Rémy de Gourmont, was Guillaume Apollinaire, one of the foremost modernist poets of the early 20th century. Apollinaire is credited with actually coining the term Cubism in 1911 and the term Surrealism in 1917. On the 17th of October 1917, Apollinaire wrote a piece called Le Bahá'isme in the Mercure de France. The piece ends, "A new voice is coming out of Asia. Already many in Europe believe that the word of Baha'u'llah does not contradict our modern science and can be assimilated for we Europeans who need comforting. Isn't it just that this comfort comes to us from Asia as it came before?" It's not clear whether Apollinaire met Abdu'l-Bahá, but he clearly made an impression on those he met, although I think it would be a stretch to say that Abdu'l-Bahá's presence inspired them to change their particular beliefs or behaviors, which in many cases cannot be said to be moderate, or even their ability to see a connection between the revelation he was promoting and the new age of which they were the leading movers and shakers. Ezra Pound, it seems, did not forget Abdu'l-Bahá. In a later article praising Tagore in The New Free Woman, Pound insists that Tagore is not to be confused with that jolly and religious bourgeois Abdu'l-Bahá. And then some years later, Abdu'l-Bahá appears in Pound's Cantos 46. It's flippant, but basically sympathetic towards Abdu'l-Bahá. Said Abdu'l-Bahá, "I said, let us speak of religion. Camel driver said, I must milk my camel. So when he had milked his camel, I said, let us speak of religion. And the camel driver said, it is time to drink milk. Will you have some? For politeness, I tried to join him. Have you ever tasted milk from a camel? I was unable to drink camel's milk. I've never been able. So he drank all of the milk, and I said, let us speak of religion. I've drunk my milk. I must dance, said the driver. We did not speak of religion. Thus Abdu'l-Bahá, third vicegerent of the first Abdul or whatever Bahá, the sage, the uniter, the founder of a religion in a garden at Uberton, Gubberton, or maybe it was some other damn suburb, but at any rate, a suburban suburb, amid a flutter of teacups. It comes perhaps then as no surprise that Ezra Pound was co-compiler with Wyndham Lewis of the list of blessed and blasted that appeared in Blast magazine. Why would he be placed among the blasted when Pound seems to have been somewhat impressed by him? Perhaps it was more to do with Pound's perception of the Baha'i movement, or any new religious movement for that matter, that a lot of silly people were mixed up in it, and the fact that the people that flocked around Abdu'l-Bahá were largely wealthy society women with a lot of time and money on their hands. What does seem clear is that esoteric or occult movements formed one basis for the modernist revolutions in the art and literature of the early 20th century. And the people moving in those circles around theosophy, spiritualism, Swedenborgianism, mesmerism, Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, these were the same people who were curious to meet Abdu'l-Bahá. These movements gave rise to artistic thinking, which intersected in everything from Kandinsky's abstractions to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and the atonal music of Schoenberg. There's a commonly perpetuated narrative of how modern art evolved, a succession of isms emerging one out of the other, rejecting time-honored rules. These isms are only dealt with in terms of the formal aspects of the work, how they rejected the norms of composition and spatial depiction, how they rejected realistic color and the photographic reproduction of reality. This acknowledgement that there was a strong spiritual component at the birth of modernism is barely ever mentioned. Indeed, art theorist Rosalind Krauss wrote in 1979 that now we find it indescribably embarrassing to mention art and spirit in the same sentence. That, thankfully, now is changing, and there have been a number of exhibitions in the last couple of years which have rediscovered artists who were drawing heavily on spiritual concepts, as well as looking more at the spiritual components of the work of well-known modernists. Many of the early Western Baha'is, including Lady Blomfield, Tudor Pole, and Alice Buckton, were clearly immersed in Theosophy, which brought them into contact with key figures in modernist art and literature. One further connection: the New Free Woman magazine that published Pound also published 2 poems by Horace Holly. Holly and his first wife, the artist Bertha Herbert, who introduced Lady Blomfield to the Baha'i Faith, was the owner of the Asher Gallery of Modern Art in Paris, and according to his obituary, Horace Holly enjoyed the entree to many interesting circles of artists and intellectuals. Holly wrote symbolist poetry, which was published in the influential Rhythm magazine. Founded in 1911, it was an avant-garde journal promoting innovative art, music, literature, and critical theory. Rhythm even included drawings by Picasso, and it was edited by none other than Professor Michael Sadler's son, also named Michael Sadler, although he changed the spelling of his surname so that he would not be confused with his father. This Michael Sadler was responsible for translating Kandinsky's seminal manifesto concerning the spiritual in art into English. Both Rhythm magazine and The Quest also published articles by Yone Noguchi, the influential modernist Japanese writer. In August 1911, Noguchi had sent Ezra Pound 2 books of his poems, and Ezra Pound was very struck by Noguchi's work. His matter is poetic, and his stuff is not like everything else. He is doubtless sent to save my artistic future, wrote Pound. He wrote to Noguchi saying, if East and West are ever to understand each other, then understanding must come slowly and come first through art. So perhaps not surprisingly, in the writings of Noguchi, we find this: I have heard so much about Abdu'l-Bahá, who people call an idealist, but I should like to call him a realist, because no idealism, when it is strong and true, exists without the endorsement of realism. There is nothing more real than his words on truth. His words are as simple as the sunlight. Again, like the sunlight, they are universal. No teacher, I think, is more important today than Abdu'l-Bahá. So here then is another lead to follow in the quest to find more connections between Abdu'l-Bahá and the modernists. I'd like to just conclude by saying that there's a very important aspect to Abdu'l-Bahá thinking about art, which I think perhaps all of these modernists didn't really register. Through their encounters with Abdu'l-Bahá, thousands of people in the West came into direct contact with a person who was the kind of embodiment of all the spiritual forces that were released with the revelation of Baha'u'llah. A revelation through which, although few of them discerned it, the whole creation was revolutionized, and all that are in the heavens and all that are on the earth was stirred to its depths. One particular aspect of the Baha'i revelation, which most of the artists and writers Abdu'l-Bahá met probably remained unaware, concerned the radical redefinition of art as being an act of worship. Abdu'l-Bahá wrote to one artist, "I rejoice to hear that thou takest pains with thine art. For in this wonderful new age, art is worship. The more thou strivest to perfect it, the closer wilt thou come to God. What bestowal could be greater than this, that one's art should be even as the act of worshipping the Lord? That is to say, when thy fingers grasp the paintbrush, it is as if thou wert at prayer in the temple. So this notion of the consecration of humanity's creative pursuits would, as Abdu'l-Bahá foresaw it in the centuries ahead, give rise, he said, to a new art, a new architecture, fused of all the beauty of the past, but new. So despite all of its cultural ferment and experimentation then, the early years of the 20th century, this landscape of false confidence and deep despair, of scientific enlightenment, of spiritual gloom, onto this landscape, the luminous figure of Abdu'l-Bahá appeared. But even then, his appearance in the West, his coming to Great Britain, were really only the first streaks of the dawn of a new cycle of human power. Thank you very much. If anyone has some questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Robert. That was that was quite a journey, I think, into a period and a movement that I had very little knowledge of. So hopefully there's some questions that have arisen, either about Abdu'l-Bahá or the modernism, or any of the publications or letters or your research.
Sure. I think it's really interesting, actually, as I said, that Abdu'l-Bahá was actually very well known, and that when he came to the West, you know, people wanted to meet him and were keen to be in his company. And he wasn't the first, if you like, Eastern teacher to come to the West. There'd been a whole succession of swamis and gurus who'd come from India and other parts of the East. But what's very different about Abdu'l-Bahā's mission, first of all, most of them were coming to raise money for their ashrams and their projects back home, or to establish new ones in the West. Abdu'l-Bahá never took a penny from anyone. And it's noted actually by the press on his journeys that he, whereas everyone else was out to sort of raise money, he was giving it away. He was going, in London, he goes to the Salvation Army hostel on Christmas Day, and he gives money, you know, so that everyone can be fed, and then leaves more money with them so that they can be fed again on New Year's Eve. And when he's in New York, he goes to the Bahá'í mission and does the same thing. And when people gave Abdu'l-Bahá gifts and so on, he always gave them back and said, sell it and give the money to the poor. So he was even offered a ticket on the Titanic when he was first traveling to Europe and to North America. And he declined it, thankfully, and said, you know, it's too expensive. I'd rather travel more cheaply and less glamorous style. So Abdu'l-Bahá was always in a mode of giving, and he was also probably the only one of those teachers that spoke about the oneness of humanity and also the equality of men and women. And he was a great supporter of women's rights. He met with Mrs. Pankhurst and leading suffragettes. So he wasn't just seen as a kind of mystical figure. He was seen as someone who was very much concerned with social justice. And that was very distinctive.
Thank you. I think we have two questions. One is Paul says, could you tell us something about the Baha'i Faith and the painter Mark Toby? And then afterwards, Tala has asked if any of the artists actually drew or painted him. So,
but yes, Mark Toby was a American painter. He was in New York in the early years of the 20th century, trying to find his way find his style, really, find his way of painting. And one night he was at a dinner and he met a painter called Juliet Thompson, and she found him quite interesting and said, would you like to come to my studio so I can paint you? So he goes along to Juliet Thompson's studio to have his portrait painted. And while he's there, he notices this picture of Abdu'l-Bahá on the wall. He doesn't pay much attention to it, really, and he doesn't ask about it. But he says while he's sitting there having his portrait painted, he sort of dozes off, and this image, this face, is sort of quite important in his dream, if you like. So he does ask her, and she tells him, and he goes off to Greenacre, which is a Baha'i school in Maine, and spends about a month there, and just immediately kind of responds to the spirit and the teachings of the faith, and then goes to teach in Seattle, and then eventually in the 1930s comes to Britain and goes to teach at Dartington Hall. Dartington was a very sort of progressive school in Devon, which basically is a very sort of wealthy American woman called Dorothy Whitney. You know, there was a Whitney Museum in New York, and Dorothy Whitney bought Dartington Hall, and she just, anytime she met someone that she thought was interesting, she said, come and teach at my school, and she'd scour the world. So she invites Mark Toby to come and teach art at Dartington. And she invites the potter Bernard Leach from Cornwall to come and teach at Dartington, which is where these two meet. And Mark Toby teaches Bernard Leach about the Baha'i faith as well. So they become very, very close friends for life. And Mark Toby develops, while he's at Dartington, he'd studied Oriental art, he'd studied calligraphy. And one night at Dartington, he's just sat in front of his canvas, and he paints very quickly this sort of mesh of lines, almost calligraphic marks, which form this kind of web on the surface of the canvas. And here's someone who, he was already in his 30s or coming up 40s, and he'd been struggling to find his style. And he was very well educated in art. He knew how to paint like all the great classical painters, but at the same time, he was very attracted to Cubism and Surrealism and so on. And suddenly he had this kind of breakthrough moment where he developed this spontaneous kind of white writing, as he called it, and hit upon this kind of approach to abstraction, which then became very, very influential. And we know that, for example, in the 1940s, Jackson Pollock saw Mark Toby's paintings in New York and was very impressed by them. And then about 10 years later, Jackson Pollock starts doing very large canvases in a very sort of similar vein. And we, unfortunately, because of Jackson Pollock's sort of celebrity, Mark Toby's sort of rather been sidelined in the history of art, but he was actually very, very important and influential. And he went on to win the first prize in the Venice Biennale in 1957, and then he had an exhibition at the Louvre. He was the first living artist to have an exhibition at the Louvre in 1961. So he was very, very well known and very important. Similarly, Bernard Leach went on to become known as the sort of father of studio pottery in Britain. So we have two sort of very prominent and important figures in 20th century art who were followers of the Baha'i faith. Yeah, so there's a lot more to be said about Mark Toby. I've got another talk about Mark Toby if you want.
Am I right in saying you've got a book as well, or not?
No, I've done a little book about Bernard Leach and the
Bernard
Baha'i faith.
Leach, yeah.
I wrote my master's thesis about Mark Toby.
Mark Toby. Okay, I knew you'd written something.
Yeah.
And I'll just read out Thelma's question.
Yeah.
We're looking, who was the artist to whom Abdu'l-Bahá spoke about holding the paintbrush and the feeling of being in the temple.
Ah, that's interesting. Yes, so that was a letter that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote to Juliet Thompson. But it's interesting because that that letter begins by saying, "Please convey my greetings to Mr. Toby." So Mark Toby is actually specifically mentioned in the beginning of that letter. So although the letter was written to Juliet Thompson, he mentions Mark Toby at the beginning of it. So let me just show you. Yeah, I found this document. Of course, no one knew what Abdu'l-Bahá looked like, really. There was only one photograph of Abdu'l-Bahá, which was taken in Adrianople. This is like a passport photograph that was taken during the period in Adrianople. So before 1868, when they were banished to Acre. So there was this picture of Abdu'l-Bahá as a young man, and no one had any other picture of Abdu'l-Bahá. So when the first Western Baha'is went to the Holy Land to meet him in 1898, that was already 30 years on from this photograph. So they thought Abdu'l-Bahá would look like this. But of course, by then, he was already a much older man. His hair was white, his beard was white, and so on. And when the first Western pilgrims went to visit Abdu'l-Bahá, they took their cameras with them and they said, "Can we take photographs of you to take back to show your new followers in America?" And he was very reluctant to have his photograph taken because he didn't want to emphasize his personality. He was very humble. And he said, "This isn't important, the form isn't important. What's important is the spirit of the person." And they begged and begged and asked him, "Please, can we take your photograph?" And he said, "You can take a picture of my hand." So there's this photograph was taken of Abdu'l-Bahā's hand, and that was taken back to America. And it was the only picture they had of him until he actually came to the West. So then when he's in London, the paparazzi are all out because he, like I say, he was very famous and people wanted to take his picture. So the press were out gathering around the door of Lady Blomfield's apartment and in different places, and they were snapping away. And Lady Blomfield says to him, "Please, Abdu'l-Bahá, please, can we go and take some proper photographs of you in a studio? So that we can, at least the quality of the pictures is good, unlike these ones where he's sort of coming in and out of doorways and so on." So this is one of the first pictures of Abdu'l-Bahá that was taken in London at a studio called Lafayette. And there's several of these from this period. Then when Juliet Thompson herself paints Abdu'l-Bahā's portrait when he's in New York, which is now lost, but there's this photograph of it. And she does that in one sitting. And Juliet was a neighbor of Khalil Gibran, the author of The Prophet, and very good friends with him. And Abdu'l-Bahá also goes one morning down the road from Juliet's place to Khalil Gibran's, and Gibran draws him. And Khalil Gibran was one of the figures who was very, very moved by Abdu'l-Bahá, very influenced by him. And he wrote a book called Jesus, the Son of Man. And he says to Juliet Thompson, "When I wrote Jesus, Son of Man, Abdu'l-Bahá was in my mind the whole time." So although he didn't write about Abdu'l-Bahá specifically, he modeled his description of Jesus on Abdu'l-Bahá. And he did this drawing of him in 1912. And then some of the other American artists, there was a kind of tradition of medallion making in America at that time. So this was an artist called Theodore Spicer Simpson who made this medallion. He was English actually, but he made this portrait medallion of Abdu'l-Bahá shortly before he died. I think it was Spicer Simpson, or was it? Oh no, there were two medallions made. So this one's by Theodore Spicer Simpson. He also made, as it says here, medallions of President Roosevelt and H.G. Wells and Winston Churchill and so on. He did a whole series of them. And then another medallion maker was called Lewis McLennan Potter, and he made this one. And he was also introduced to Abdu'l-Bahá by Juliet Thompson. And he got involved with some sort of quack healer who gave him some herbs that were meant to cure something and ended up poisoning him. And he died 3 months after doing this medallion. That's both sides. It was a double-sided thing. So on one side it's the picture of Abdu'l-Bahá, and the other side it's this love, peace and unity symbol. Then there's this artist called Frances Sewell Campbell. She's from the west coast of America, and she does this drawing of Abdu'l-Bahá, which is rather beautiful. Abdu'l-Bahá apparently approved this one very much. He said it was the best one that had been done. And then in Paris, Abdu'l-Bahá has his portraits taken as well. And then a very interesting pioneering woman photographer called Gertrude Cassibier, who Juliet Thompson takes Abdu'l-Bahá to her studio. And she does this series of photographs, which are quite unusual. Gertrude Cassibier had done a lot of portraits of Native Americans. So when the Sitting Bull and some of the sort of prominent chiefs had come through New York, she'd done these amazing photographs of them. But they're very tender and very artistic, I think. And then when Abdu'l-Bahá's in Budapest, this painter, Robert Nadler, does this portrait, which is quite an unusual one as well. Very, very sort of, I suppose you could call it impressionistic. And Robert Nadler was a prominent Esperantist in Budapest and spent quite a bit of time with Abdu'l-Bahá, was very impressed by him, painted his portrait. And then interestingly, when Abdu'l-Bahá's in Paris, this is one of the very first color photographs ever produced. And it's genuinely a color photograph. It's not black and white that's been colored in. There was a studio in Paris, Valentin Vocam, who developed this process of printing in color. And this picture was taken, I think, the second time Abdu'l-Bahá was in Paris. And it's appeared in some of the books about the history of photography as being an important early photograph, because it's one of the very first color pictures that's ever been made. So yeah, that's just a selection of some of the images of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Really beautiful, thank you. And we were talking before the meeting started. You also you're at the moment you have a podcast, you were saying, that on a regular basis.
Yes.
And I think when we what we usually do after the talk, we send an email to thank the attendees and provide links of interest. So we'll include this podcast link, but can you explain a little bit? You collaborate.
Yes. This podcast is called Ambassador to Humanity. It's going to be 9 episodes in total. There have been 4 have come out already. You can find them if you go to Bahá'íTeachings.org under the podcasts. And basically they're 9 half-hour episodes, which tell a variety of, the first 3 episodes are really sort of biographical. They introduce Abdu'l-Bahá, his life, up, and the 3rd episode is his travels to the West. And then each of the episodes after that deals with how he engaged with the discourses of his time. So the episode that was published today is Abdu'l-Bahá and racial unity. The next one is Abdu'l-Bahá and gender equality. And the one after that is Abdu'l-Bahá and peace, the peace movement. And then the next few episodes after that, one is Abdu'l-Bahá's the concept of service, what it means to live a life of service. And the following one is Abdu'l-Bahá's concepts of the life of the spirit. So yeah, there'll be 9 episodes in all, and 4 of them have already been released. They're coming out every Friday. So, and there's a whole array of talented voices. Some of the Baha'is who are actors in Hollywood, presenting and voicing some of the parts, and some of our British Baha'i actors, along with contributions by sort of authors and scholars and researchers commenting on the different aspects. I think you'll enjoy them.
Yes, and
You can find it on Apple Podcasts, on a number of different
YouTube, you said as well, didn't
YouTube.
you? Yeah. We'll send a link for the YouTube ones, I think.
Yeah.
Get those
and yes, some of the different podcasts. If you just look for Ambassadors to Humanity on your podcast provider, you'll probably find it. Yeah,
we'll definitely share that, because lots of thank yous coming through. The link has already been shared, and just looking at some of the messages. Yes, we will send out the link in an email. It will be in a day or two, but it's almost 8 o'clock. I just really want to say a special thank you again, Robert, for giving your time and sharing your own thread of curiosity and research into modernism, art, publications, groups and societies, and even personal letters, and what their impressions of Abdu'l-Bahá. And I feel like you've really given us some hidden gems that there's no way we would have found them on our own. So thank you for sort of piquing our interest. And everybody, I'm sure I'm going to look up some of those names and publications and societies myself. And and that's the whole point of these talks, to encourage us to continue our own learning. Whether we're a Baha'i or not, it's always interesting to learn about the history and its impact on us today. So if anybody has any, before in the photos, yes, Jeremy also agrees that there were lots of pictures and photos that we'd never seen before. So that was a really wonderful share for us. So so basically to say to everybody, thank you all for attending, whether you've attended one or all of these talks. They are on the Baha'i Society YouTube channel, and in the next day or two, this will be shared in an email, follow-up email from through Eventbrite. So please look out for that. If you wish to remain in touch with the Baha'i Society, please share your email address. You can respond, and we will continue to share any events, whether they're on Eventbrite or in person or on Zoom, and we'll continue to keep you up to date. And if you have any further questions, if you've anything at all, we will try to answer them, or share them with the right person as well, whether it's to do with the talk this evening or talks that have been in the past. So again, I'd encourage you to share any of this with friends as well. So it's all free for you to share, and hopefully have conversations as well. So again, thank you very much, Robert, for your time, and thank you to everybody. I wish you all a safe holiday break, and a warm one as well. So just say goodnight to everybody and take care. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.